That said, hi, I'm Christian Stevenson, Hancock County, Mississippi Extension Agent with the Mississippi State University Extension Service, joining you by Zoom for another horticulture presentation. Really happy to have you here today. We'll tell you if you have any questions while I'm talking, please put those in the chat area, and I'll either answer those as I'm going because we'll see them as they come up, or I'll always take some time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you're watching this on YouTube, I appreciate you joining us there as well. And if you have questions on YouTube, just put those down in the comments section. And if if I see that question there, I'll get a little notification that tells me to come in and answer that question. And of course, you'll get a notification that it's been answered. And so that's a really great way for me to be able to get those answers out to you as well. With that said, today we're going to be talking about starting a spring garden. I know we're in sort of the mid-late part of January, but now really is a good time to start thinking about our plans for the coming spring. And I do want to preface my talk. I'm really going to hit the vegetable side of things pretty hard during the course of this presentation. A lot of what I'm going to say, almost everything that I'm going to say, applies to flowers as well. We can kind of translate that to ornamental horticulture as well. And I'll be giving some presentations following up that really start looking at some flowers and some options as we're getting into the spring season. So I hope you'll join me for that as well. So one of the things that I have often recommended to people is that we keep a good, a record of the things that we do in our landscape. Just having a little notebook or a file on your computer that talks about what you've been doing in your landscape, what worked really well for you, what maybe didn't work very well for you, areas of your landscape that are receiving this or that amount of shade, areas that tend to stay wet. All of that is really valuable information that you can use in the coming year to help you plan what goes into your landscape. So, if you know that area is going to be a little bit shady, you can select plants for that. Or if you know areas that tend to hold a little bit more water, then you're going to want to make sure that you select plants that are going to tolerate those conditions, really thrive and beautify your landscape. So of course, when we're talking about a vegetable garden, a lot of what we're looking at is how many plants we're going to have, how many tomatoes you might want, or how many bell peppers you might want, and how much space you have. And I really like to use graph paper for this. Use that graph paper to really block out what I'm doing and figure out what I can fit, paying attention to the spacing that's going to go into that garden. So, of course, spacing is going to be really important. And again, I know I'm using vegetables as an example here, but you can find the planting, the proper plant spacing for all the flowers as well. A lot of times you're going to see that on the label for the plant. And if you don't find it there, then there are certainly resources available through MSU Extension, Louisiana Extension, and other extension services that give really good advice about how far apart we should put those plants in the landscape to give them plenty of space to develop a root system and thrive in that location. But certainly, with something like a tomato, you're generally planning for about a 24-inch center on that. So you want to make sure that those plants are about 2 feet apart. And that's just the distance they're going to need. They're going to spread out. Things like beans can be planted much closer together. Things like onions, even closer than that, 3 inches apart. And just having that plan on plant spacing is really going to help you in terms of of figuring out how many plants you need to get, how many plants you need to start for the coming season, and you don't wind up doing what I do every year, which is overbuying. So I wind up with a lot more seedlings than I actually require for the garden space that I have. Now, certainly, we can do a little bit of intensive gardening. We can really pack those plants into that space. Oftentimes, we do that in, if we have kind of limited area to work with in our garden. We're generally not going to be planting in rows. We're going to put things in blocks because it's just a more efficient use of space. And by using this intensive gardening and really effective planning, we can make sure that we are getting the absolute most out of the area that we have. And when you do this, one thing that you really want to pay attention to, regardless of what type of plant you're talking about, is different plants have different requirements for their conditions. Some plants like shade, some plants really need that full sun. Some are going to tolerate wet conditions, others are not. Some plants need to be fertilized the same way, while other plants tend to prefer different fertilization. So you want to group together the plants that have similar requirements. And that's going to, of course, they're all going to thrive. They're all going to, take care of each other a lot better. And another factor that you want to think about when you do this is the growth habit of the plant. And this is important whether we're talking about flowers or if we're talking about vegetables. That you don't necessarily want to put two tall growing plants really close together because they're going to wind up fighting each other. But having a tall growing plant and then low growing plants alongside it really makes effective use of that. So planting a lower growing plant alongside sunflowers or planting some basil or some lettuce around the base of tomatoes is a really good way to make a lot of effective use of the garden space. And normally when we're when we're talking about plant spacing, really commonly what we talk about is we need to put these plants 4 inches apart, and it assumes that when we're doing that, that we are putting the same plants in that same location. So if we're putting together plants that have different spacing requirements, what we want to do is we want to respect the spacing requirements of both of them. So what we do really simply is we just take those spacing requirements and add them together. So for example, if you have tomatoes and lettuces like you see in this picture, tomato needs about 24 inches of space on each side. Lettuce needs about 4. So when you're going to put them together, you add the 24 and the 4, that gives you 28. But then you get to divide it in half. So that's going to give you 14. So you plant the lettuce about 14 inches away from the tomatoes. And really, you can apply that pretty broadly to a lot of the plants that you would be growing together. Again, whether those are flowers or whether those are vegetables. You also want to think, and again, regardless of what kind of gardening we're talking about, you want to think about successional planting. And this, in my mind, I do all my home vegetable gardening in containers, and we can have that presentation again sometime soon. But you want to think, eventually the plant that I have here, if I might plant peas early in the season, and I really like to plant peas for flowers because I just like the way that they look, then they're going to get tired at some point, and that space is not going to be being effectively used in my garden anymore. So when they get tired, when it's time to remove them, I've still got a lot of growing season left. So that's going to let me figure out something that's going to be able to come behind that crop that can use that same space and just kind of plan to continue on. And we can talk about the same thing with flowers. Some flowers that bloom early in the season, at least with annuals, they're going to bloom early in the season, and they might be done at that point. They might not, they might not flower again. It may be time to think about replacing them. And we want to think, we want to come up with something that's going to be, going to work really well, replacing the plant at that time. When that plant is done, what can I plant after that that's going to thrive in that environment, being planted on that date? Of course, I have to mention this as an important part of preparing for the spring season. It is really important to make sure that we're doing the right fertilization, have the right soil conditions for the plants that we're growing, and soil testing is really the best way for us to know how, what conditions we have for those plants. So, taking a soil sample, relatively straightforward, just dig down to about 4 to 6 inches, and do that 15 or 20 places around the area where you're gardening. Combine all that together and mix it up really thoroughly. Take about a pint of that and bring that into the office, one of the extension offices, regardless of what county you're in. And for the best $8 you can spend in horticulture, we will send that off to the state soil testing lab, and they'll come back after about 2 weeks with a good answer regarding what the pH of your soil is, and what fertilization you need to do for the kind of plants that you're putting in that location. So just, in terms of making sure we're giving the right nutrition to the plant, and probably more important than anything else, getting the pH right, so that plants are able to take up the nutrients from the soil. I think soil testing is really important. And I think it's really important, if I tell people when do I take a soil test for that spring garden, and I think now is a really good time. We've got a little bit of time before we're getting those plants in, and that's going to give us time to get that answer back, and be able to do that fertilization in time to have those plants at that location. I mentioned that pH is really important, and it affects how plants are able to take up nutrients from the soil. The vast majority of plants really want a pH somewhere in that around, I usually say 6.5 is what I'm aiming for. Um, and you can look at this chart here. This is from a plant physiology textbook. And you can see those two lines where between 5.5 and 6.5. And that's really just the maximum area for where the plants are able to take up those nutrients. Now, that being said, there are exceptions to every rule, and there are plants that are going to thrive better at different pH values. So, a good example of that would be blueberries. Azaleas are another example of a plant that tends to prefer a pH value that's more acidic than what we're seeing here. But as a good sort of rule of thumb, that 5.5 to 6.5 range will serve you well. I lean more towards the 6.5 on that. But a good soil test will give you recommendations based off of the plant that you're growing. Now, I often do get, a lot of people saying, I'm going to bring soil in to revitalize my garden. I'm going to bring soil in to fix this problem that I'm having in my landscape. And I'm always a little nervous about doing that. So I have generally found that it is a lot better to work with the soil that you have than it is to bring in another soil. So there's two elements of that. The first is that I think that there is um, um, a real importance of something that I've said several times, which is that it's a lot better to fit the plant to the location than try to fit the location to the plant. So if you have a problem, a really wet area, the ideal solution to that in my mind, is to plant things that are going to like that condition. I think that's what you're going to get the best response out of. The other problem that I see with hauling in soil of any sort, really, is that I know what problems I have. I know what I'm dealing with. When I get soil hauled in, I'm not really sure what problems I'm inheriting from where that soil came from. So it may have weed seeds in it. There may be insects in it. It may have some plant disease organism in it that I'll be introducing into my landscape. That tends to be bulk soil. If you get a few bags of pine bark or things like that, or garden soil, those tend to be a little bit more reliable, but are really expensive at the volumes that are going to make a difference in a garden. So um, there are some times when you do want to fill in areas or raise the level, but I generally find that hauling in soil is just kind of asking for trouble. And when we want to prepare garden soil is important as well. There's a little bit of a version thing going on with my PowerPoint file, and I apologize for that. Um, so you don't want to get started too early in the season. You want to make sure that the moisture level is right. And a lot of times when you have soils that people say they have difficult soils, sometimes they're just starting a little bit early. Obviously, the middle picture there with the shovel is not one taken in South Mississippi with all the frost that's around that hole. But you want to make sure that you're looking and figuring out when your soil is ready to get started. And one way to do this is just take some of your soil from about 3 inches down and just squeeze it in your hand and drop it on the sidewalk and make sure that it rototills. One time, sometimes we do have heavy clay soils, and no matter what we do, that soil is just going to hold water all the time. And that is a time when we need to think about adding organic matter. But you want to make sure the soil's dry enough and starts to warm up so that we can start tilling it or breaking it up to get those plants in. Ideally, till down to about 6 to 8 inches. Does not have to be flower fine. In fact, that can actually cause problems. We want some marble-sized particles in there. That's going to keep that soil broken up and keep it from turning into kind of like concrete. It'll all bind together, if like flour when you get it wet, or like cornstarch when you get it wet. So that'll work. Just level it out. And that final soil surface should be as level as possible. That's going to really help with water infiltration in the garden. So now we've got our soil squared away, we need to pick plants that are going to do well in our landscape. And there are a few tools for doing this. Of course, every year I get sent a large number of garden catalogs and seed catalogs that I can look at, and I always enjoy that. Um, I have several of them just sitting on my desk that have come in the mail recently. And those are great places to look for sort of what's new out there, and what just really catches your eye as being interesting. But I do look at the variety trials that are done wherever you are across the United States. The All American Selections program does a fantastic job of evaluating different varieties and selecting out varieties that are going to do well in a diverse in diverse landscapes across the U.S. Here in Mississippi, we have the Mississippi Medallion Plants program. Those do really well and really build up excitement around a particular kind of plant that really performs well. Um, Over in Louisiana, they have plant trials as well. They have the Louisiana Super Plant Program that does a really fantastic job of identifying varieties that do a fantastic job in that environment. So if I can get away with it, I always want to propagate plants from seed. A large part of that is because of cost. So, if you go to a garden center or if you go to a big box store buying transplants for your garden, it gets expensive. You might be paying anywhere from $1 a plant up to $4, $5, $6 a plant for those going into your landscape, and that gets pricey very quick. So propagating from seed, whereas one plant may cost $4 for a particular plant, with seed I can pay $4 and get 25 seed or 100 seed depending on the plant that I'm talking about. So it is really a lot more cost effective to be able to propagate those plants from seed. So you do want to make sure your seed are healthy. Ideally, while we can save seed year to year, fresher seed do tend to germinate better. If you are saving seed, you do want to make sure you refrigerate them, keep them in a cool environment. Most seed will last even unrefrigerated so long as they're kept cool and dry, but they can store for quite a few years in a cool environment or in your refrigerator, even longer in a freezer if you're careful to make sure there's no water there. You do not want to store your seed with any fruits or vegetables. A lot of fruits and vegetables will give off a chemical called ethylene that's important in maturation for fruit, but it can also wake up those seed at a time you don't really want them to be, and that can lead to the seed being unviable. When we're talking about germination, most seed are going to prefer to germinate between 75 and 80 degrees. Again, obviously, there's some variation there with plants that tend to be very early spring, germinating early, at lower temperatures. But that's again a good rule of thumb. And what that basically says, it's a really good idea to germinate those seeds inside where we have a more controlled environment. If you have them in a cooler place, they do make mats that you can put underneath your seed starting tray. They just act as warmers and really help get those seed to germinate by getting that temperature up. Now, once seeds start to germinate, it is really critical that we maintain moisture for them. That plant is really small. The first thing it's going to put out is a little root system. And following that, it really needs to make sure that it's taking up water that it needs to grow. So you want to make sure that the right amount of water is there to maintain the health of that germinating seed. And the trick there is overwatering and underwatering can both be problematic. So you just want to keep that soil kind of evenly moist. Use a really good soil medium or seed starting medium to start that out. And one thing that does work fairly well is soaking seeds prior to planting. And I think I've got an image of that coming along. In terms of the media that I prefer for starting seed, I really think a soilless mix is preferable. So those are going to be either a material like peat, um, may also have some perlite or some vermiculite in there, which are just spacing materials. So they allow a little bit more air to get down to the roots where the plant needs to take up oxygen. So one of my favorite materials for starting seed is called coir. It's spelled COIR, which always makes me think I'm mispronouncing it. But coir is the way I've heard it every time. And that is made from coconut husk. So it's a nice sort of renewable material that can be used in seed starting. And you'll often find it in those little pellets that you see an image of there. You add water to that and it expands outward. You can also find it in larger blocks that you add water to, but you can find it in bags, and you can find just bags of media that use coir as their primary component rather than peat or pine bark or other things like that. And I really tend to prefer it. It wets up very easily. One issue that we commonly see with peat is that peat gets a little bit hydrophobic. It does not like to get wet once it's dry, and I don't experience that with coir. But That's why I prefer it. Light is generally not an issue for the seeds to actually germinate. There are a few cases where that is required for really small seeded plants. Annual vinca has to be in complete darkness in order to germinate. But it's not a factor most of the time. What is important with that is that once the plant emerges, that light becomes very important. One of the frequent issues that I see when germinating seeds, or when I see other people germinating seeds, is the plant gets really long and tall before it puts on leaves. We call it, getting leggy, um, and that is generally a response to not having enough light. So if you start to see that plant growing real tall before it puts on leaves, what it's telling you is that it needs more light in order to become a healthy plant. Again, starting seeds, use that soilless potting mix, moisten it, scatter the seeds on top, and then add on more potting mix. One thing that even I frequently do is as I'm putting the seeds down, I put the seeds down and I just kind of poke them into the ground. If you put down a layer of your seed starting mix, put the seeds on top of it, and just sprinkle the soil over the top of it to the depth that's recommended for that particular seed. I think that'll do a really good job for you. Mist the top with a spray bottle. And if you're in, if you really want to make sure that water's staying there, you can cover it up with plastic wrap. That will help some of that moisture stay in there until the seeds actually germinate. Of course, you want to take that right off the second you start seeing them peeking up above the soil line. Um, we'll see seeds will germinate at temperatures down to 65 degrees. They do prefer a little bit warmer temperatures than that. And again, you can start seeds on just on a paper towel. You'll actually see them start to germinate, and then you can transplant those off to a seed starting tray. But one of the things that can be really disappointing, if you don't have a high germination rate on your seed, you don't want to waste space in your tray. This saves that a little bit, and because you're only going to be moving the ones that you see germinate. It also tends to speed up the process of that seed germination, so that you can save a couple of days in the time it takes to get your plants ready. Again, once you get those seedlings, really good sunny area, make sure that they get that light that they need. Now, most seed, you put them in the ground, you put them in soil, you give them water, you give them a warm enough place, and they will just germinate all on their own. There are some plants that require a little bit of seed treatment in order to effectively germinate. And what that's really doing is kind of mimicking the way that that plant would spread in the natural environment. So some, plants are evolved to have the seeds and the fruit being eaten by birds, and it goes through the bird and comes out, and that's how the plant spreads from place to place. Or it might be eaten by giraffes or something of the same sort. By using scarification, what we're doing is we're mimicking the process there. And normally for homeowners, what I would recommend is just using something like a nail file or the like to just gently scar the outside of that seed, if that's something that's required for that particular plant. And maybe I need to put together a presentation where I kind of expand a little bit just on seed germination. But other methods can be used. In some cases, we use acids to scar the surface of the seed. My story on this is trying to propagate kudzu. Was doing it in a lab to try to investigate a virus that affects kudzu. And I would have thought that kudzu would be the easiest thing in the world to grow because it takes off so well. But we had a significant bit of trouble getting the kudzu seeds to germinate. They had to be soaked in sulfuric acid twice in order to get them to germinate. So some seeds are easier than others. If you want to soak large seeds prior to getting the germinate, you can just use a mason jar like this. This would be peas. You can actually see the seeds expand and start to take on water and break dormancy as they're sitting there in the water. Now, temperatures are low right now. And so, as we're moving plants out to the landscape, we do want to make sure that we keep them protected. Two ways we can do that is the use of either cold frames or hot boxes. These are basically the same thing. The difference between a cold frame and a hot box is that a hot box has heat added to it. A cold frame is just passive heat that it takes in from the sun, uses the greenhouse effect inside that to very effectively raise the temperature, 5 to 10 degrees. And you can use that as a place to harden off some of those tender perennials, get them started early in the season so they're ready to get started out in open soil when it's time when the temperatures are higher and it's time to get them out into the landscape. You can also use this as a convenient place to overwinter things, because it's going to be able to provide a little bit of cold protection over the course of the winter. Hotbed, again, very much the same thing. It's just a miniature greenhouse. Usually, you can use compost to heat them. They do have electrical systems that are used to heat them, but I like to use decomposition as the tool there. You do want your hotbed or cold frame to have southern exposure. That's where it's going to get the most sunlight, and that way you're going to get the most heating out of it. And if you want to reduce any difficulty with that and kind of help that a little bit more, having a windbreak to the north or to the northwest can be really effective. All you have to do for that, put it next to a building or put some hay bales right there as a windbreak, and that works really well. And it doesn't have to be complicated to build one of these. My favorite version of a cold frame is the one that you see in the top picture there. You just have stacked hay bales and an old glass door, old storm door, put there, and of course you have another one right in front of it to seal that off, and that works really effectively to get that greenhouse effect. With a cold frame, you can just put it level with the soil. With a hotbed, you're going to dig lower than that. Put your compost or manure in there to serve as that heat source. You can use an electric coil. I tend to shy away from that just because you have to keep a power source hooked up to it. Watering is extraordinarily important. I always use this slide where I talk about the most important time for a plant for there to be proper watering, most critical periods of time for watering: seed germination, early growth, flower and fruit development, root enlargement, root caps, root crops, and following transplanting. So basically, all the time is really important to have good watering for seed germination, for uniform growth, for being productive, either flowers or vegetables. What I will say is that seedlings are especially intolerant of running out of water or having too much water because it's such a small plant, because it's so young. It is going to be a lot more susceptible to damage than a plant that would be larger. Particularly in raised bed areas, they do tend to run out. They do tend to have more water requirements than for areas that are just native soil. And so they will need to be watered more frequently. And you really want to check the water whenever and add more. There's the standard method of just sticking your finger down in there, seeing if it feels dry 2 or 3 inches below the soil. And I normally tell people that plants in the landscape require about an inch of water a week. For something like a raised bed, you may have to add about twice that in order to maintain the amount of water that's required for that area. In terms of how to add water into a landscape, now I've done a presentation on irrigation in the home landscape, and I do encourage you to go to the YouTube channel and take a look at that. How we add water in the landscape can be really important for the health of our plants. I know a lot of people are using sprinkler systems for their lawns and for their garden areas. And there are things that we need to watch with those sprinkler systems. Often they apply water too quickly, and that water isn't able to soak into the soil, and it runs off, and that can erode our soil, lead to puddles and cause soil compaction. And the as a with the background of plant pathology, I'm always concerned whenever we're putting water on the leaves of the plant, because that tends to make problems with fungi and bacterial diseases more likely, because those diseases require extended periods of leaf wetness in order for them to take place. So ideally, we don't want to water all the time. We want to water deeply and infrequently. And that's really going to promote the root system developing and getting bigger for that plant, which over time is going to result in a healthier plant. And you do also want to make sure that sprinkler systems, if you're using them, aren't just hitting one plant and falling to the ground and not watering the rest of the area. Oftentimes that means we need to raise that sprinkler system up. And an easy way with a sprinkler system to figure out how much water you're applying is just get some small cans. I always use tuna fish cans for this. Set it out at different areas of the landscape, turn the system on, and I see how long it takes to deliver an inch of water, hopefully evenly to all of those cans. But do pay attention. Some areas are going to have bigger water requirements. So you may want to point those sprinklers or design those sprinkler systems so that so that you make sure that you're delivering the amount of water that each area of the landscape needs. As I've already mentioned, leaf wetness can lead to a little bit more plant disease, so we do want to watch out with that. But I normally recommend and I advocate for the use of drip irrigation systems. Again, regardless of what kind of plants we're talking about, and this is a great time of year to get those systems set up. And we don't have we don't necessarily have a lot going on as far as work in the garden. So now is a great time to install irrigation systems and go back, look at that plan for what you want to put where, to help help figure out where we're going to put those lines. Usually that drip irrigation system is going to consist of a plastic hose that has drip nozzles, kind of a regular spacing down the length of it. So you want to make sure that those holes are along the side of the plant, underneath the mulch you're applying. You've got a filter in there to keep that line from getting blocked up. And they operate at a low pressure. They deliver a small amount of water over time. And that can be helpful for two reasons. The water is going to go right down to the root system where the plant needs it. It's not going to be sprayed up. So you're not going to have as much of that water evaporate off. It's not going to be getting on the leaves. So it's a really effective way to deliver that water to the plants. The other thing is, one of my least favorite things to happen to me when I'm out in the garden is for the sprinkler system to turn on. And with a drip irrigation system, that's not something you have to worry about. Really, the only disadvantage for these systems is, there is a little bit greater initial cost. You need to make sure that you're, purchasing the line. You generally will need a timer to go with it. But a lot of different garden centers sell the parts to these, and they are really effective for use in the landscape. Reduce, you're going to drop your water bill or your electricity bill if you're using a well, and they just work really well. Make sure again that's going to keep the soil right at the keep that drip line right at the base of the plants. And you can see on this bottom picture here that you can see how it's laid out to deliver water where those plants are going to be placed in the landscape. So we make sure that we're delivering the amount of water that's needed. And you will need to use multiple lines. If you have a raised bed, then you're generally going to need to have several lines going across it to deliver all of the water that's required. But still relatively easy to set up. Another good thing to consider this time of year is mulching. Mulches are going to do a really good job in the landscape of two different things. One, they present a barrier on top of the soil, and that's going to help with competition from weeds. So the weeds aren't able to get sunlight, and so you're just going to have to do less weeding, which is a big goal for me in the in landscaping. Is just not having to go out there and do the parts of it that I don't like, which weeding is kind of one of. Of course, it's also a barrier to any potential disease issues that might be staying in your soil. You know, it kind of presents a barrier there to help keep that from splashing up onto your plant during a rain. Other thing that mulching is going to do really effectively is it's going to cool the soil. So we have some really hot summers here in South Mississippi or South Louisiana. And you know, during the hottest part of the year, you know, those plants are really struggling to keep up with that temperature, and having that mulch there just moderates that a little bit and keeps the soil a little bit cooler, which can help those plants just thrive a little bit better during the hotter part of the year. I'm not a huge fan of landscape fabric, but you can use things like newspaper over the top, underneath at the actual soil surface, and then put mulch on top of it. And again, that presents a really good weed barrier, and that newspaper will biodegrade just like the mulch will. And in this case, I have a question in the chat area. You don't have to shred up the newspaper. I actually prefer to keep it in big sheets so I can just lay those down, and that's just really effective. You don't want to shred it up, because what we're doing is we're basically having it serve like a blanket over the top of the soil, and then we put the pine bark or the pine straw on top of that. Now, there are some early season pests that we do want to pay attention to. Always have to add the insects here at the end. Aphids are a really common problem as we get into the early year. As I've mentioned before, their populations can expand really, really quickly. Um, and we tend to need to look on the underside of leaves. Often the first thing we're going to see for aphids is either some yellowing on the leaves as a result of their feeding, or we may see a little bit of sticky material on the plant called honeydew that kind of comes out the end of their digestive system because they don't process all the sugars that they take in. Really easy to control aphids with neem oil or insecticidal soap. You just need to kind of make sure that you are getting a really thorough coverage of the plant, because again, if you miss one or two of them, those populations expand quickly. Very similarly, whiteflies, I consider them one of the more polite insects because it's relatively easy to figure out when you have them. If you tap the plant, little whiteflies fly everywhere. You have whiteflies. Um, Again, often found on the underside of leaves. You often see that honeydew problem, showing up because of their feeding. And insecticidal soaps and neem oil are effective for these as well. You just need to make sure that you apply it several times and get thorough coverage. We're not going to effectively control the adults. They just fly too much. But if you can get rid of the immatures, the little larvae that can't fly, that are on the underside of the leaf, they're almost too small to see. But you can get rid of the immatures with that neem oil and solve the problem in the long run. Last two I'm going to mention are thrips and mites. We're really going to talk about them together. Thrips, really small insects. Common ones that I see are the flower thrips, like the western flower thrips. Obviously, they like to feed in flowers, but they'll feed on leaves as well. And they leave kind of a stippled bronzed look on the plant. A little bit difficult to notice them because they're so small. So you can take an index card and tap the plant, and you can see them running around on that, and that will work as well. Mites, Again, also very small, not a true insect. They have too many legs, but they feed the same way. They suck on plant sap. Often they're controlled by predatory mites, but they are favored by drought, favored by high temperatures. Sometimes mite problems show up after we've applied an insecticide that would kill off the beneficials that are controlling them. So for homeowners, really the best thing for these insects or arthropods is a neem oil or insecticidal soap, good thorough coverage of the plant in order to make sure that we're getting them managed. Of course, going back to the plant disease side of things really quickly, preparation is really important. An ounce of preparation or ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. Keep that garden clean. If you didn't sanitize really thoroughly after the fall, now is a great time to get out there. Make sure you're removing any old plant debris, removing any mulch that might harbor plant disease. Add in that new clean mulch to present a barrier between any plant disease in the soil. Make sure that you're controlling weeds. Ross in a couple of weeks is going to be talking about weed management in the spring, and that is going to be a really important part of your disease management as well. Make sure that your watering is done really well. Keep the water off the plants as much as you can. Again, using drip irrigation is really handy there. When you look at those varieties that you select, if you know you have a history of a particular problem, using resistant varieties is a really important part of managing disease. And just make sure if you do purchase transplants, I always keep them separate for a week or so before I actually put them into the landscape, just to make sure that I don't see anything showing up on them that might concern me. And you want to give them a good look. Make sure you're not bringing any insects or any diseases into the landscape by bringing in any of those plants. But thank you very much. That is the end of the presentation for today. Like I said, I'm going to be having several presentations in the coming weeks that talk about particular elements of spring gardening and things that we can get ready for. Even going to talk about some of my favorite plants for spring and for summer. So I hope you'll join me for that. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, thank you very much. Any questions, please put those down in the comments section. And of course, if you are here